Thanks for joining us today, guys. Today we are joined by Axel Meierhoefer and excited for him to share a little bit about his journey and his perspective. I think, his journey will highlight, I think, a lot of things and questions that you guys may have as you're dealing with your growth. And so excited for him to share his experience. But Axel, without further ado, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely, Liam. Well, first, thank you for having me on your show, and glad to be able to come and talk a little bit about business and what to do with profits and so forth. So and people can probably tell from the accent, I'm originally from Germany and came over here because I was flying around for the Air Force, and there was an exchange program that allowed to basically stop my job in Germany, come over and do the same thing for the US Air Force. And that is, well, 26 years ago. So I only did the Air Force thing for a few years, and then it was nice weather in New Mexico and then nice weather in California, and started a consulting business. And here we are, still here now in the San Diego area. And yeah, and then basically helping people help themselves become successful. That's kind of my mantra. It always has been and still remains to be.
That's great. And I think it ties in a lot with, what we're trying to do here on the prosperity perspective and what we do in our own business in terms of, giving back and helping people is such an important part. And so it's always exciting to see other people who are doing that as well. So as you went through your consulting business, right, once you got to that point of profitability where you didn't have to worry about roof over your head, food on the table, what were some of those first things and where you spent, your extra money and your income?
Yeah, basically, as the business started to become more stable, I would say I was looking around because I thought, well, there must be, and people were talking about like 401k plans and IRAs and Roths and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't really understand a lot about it. But what I did understand was that the money, regardless what that plan may have been called, would ultimately in some way, shape or form go into the stock market. Now you have to keep in mind, I started that business in 2005, and in 2003, the dot-com bubble burst and everything, like stocks were like, evil, don't do it. So, but for me, that meant, okay, if I wanted to do something, I only knew these kind of abbreviation retirement plans, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to do something like the stock market. So that triggered to look around more on what could be an alternative. And through my military time and having been moved around quite a few times, we had every once in a while a situation where we got to a location, and as a staff officer, you're not living in the barracks or something like that. The question was, okay, should we rent something or should we buy something? And we were basically every so often, I would say, quote unquote, accidental landlords. Then you decide, okay, we'll buy something, and you thought we will be at that station for 4 years, and suddenly 2 years later the announcement comes, no, we need you to move 500 miles somewhere else or something. Well, then not always did we actually have a good opportunity to sell the property, so we rented them out for a while and sold them later. So we had a little bit of a taste of how this real estate stuff could work, but never really in a professional way. And so with the business kind of getting in more gear and generating profits, like you said, the question ultimately was, okay, well, if it's not stock market and if real estate would be the thing, how do you actually do it? And I'm the kind of person, I wouldn't never get into something that I don't really understand reasonably well. So I started researching, right? Like I'm almost one of those people who got the cassette tapes from Carlson or whatever his name was, almost. But at least it showed me, what you can learn. And it was much accelerated because for those of you who remember in 2008-9, when the real estate market crashed, for a lot of people who were in it or who owned properties, it was really a bad thing with all the foreclosures and stuff. But for me, when I was thinking about, okay, would this be an opportunity, there were suddenly thousands and thousands of properties available. And oftentimes for like really interestingly low prices, right? And so that's where we started to be willing to tip the toe in. In hindsight, I would say, wow, I should have done way more. But I also admit at the time that the numbers, right, just the sheer amounts, when you say, okay, well, I'm investing in something that costs $100,000, right? I mean, at least I have to say, from where I come from, a relatively small, low middle class background, those numbers were initially really intimidating, right? And yeah, so we started small, should have probably done more, be a little more courageous. But over the years, it has developed and we have gotten more and more knowledgeable. And then 2019, I started talking about it, obviously too often. And now we're doing, at least semi-professionally, helping people as its own business.
So as you were first getting started, right, and you went to go learn more, what was that first property that you bought purely as an investment and not kind of accidental as you were, moving locations with the military, but like, hey, I have money. I don't want it in the stock market. I want something tangible. I'm going real estate. What did you pick and why?
Well, it was actually an opportunity to buy an apartment in what I considered a pretty good location in the center of town. It was relatively small and affordable. And so all the location research was favorable and there was a high demand. So I didn't really have to be worried about not having tenants. And I thought that having something that probably over the long term would gain in value would be enough. Now, I'm not subscribing to that anymore, but I was okay knowing that it didn't really have barely any positive cash flow. The main thing was low rates at the time, relatively, a reasonably low price, and almost a guarantee to always be able to rent it.
When you said in the center of the city, what city were we talking about?
That was a city on the East Coast in the Philadelphia area. In my consulting business, I maybe should say this, I did at the time a pretty big project for Merck Pharmaceuticals, training their marketing employees in a specific process that they invited me. They had bought another company called Sharing Plow, and in the merger they looked at what does Merck do well, what does Sharing do well, and what's the delta that neither one seems to do well. And then they brought external consultants to say, okay, if you don't have a whole lot of background in this industry, how would you address something like that? So I designed a process for their marketing team. It's kind of like a funny story because I went there, presented it, flew back home to California, and I thought, okay, I'm done. I got paid, everything cool. And 3-4 weeks later, I get a call and they said, we really like what you developed. We want to actually put it into action. We want to really apply this process. You developed it. Couldn't you be the one who teaches our people how to do it? And I was like, oh yeah, that's cool, right? And then, this shows you that was still early on in my consulting career. After I said yes, I said, so how many people are we talking about? And they said, oh, it's not that bad. It's only 750 in the US and 350 internationally. And so for 2 years, probably about on average, every 6 weeks, I flew to Lansdale, Pennsylvania. I found out things that I never knew existed, like a form of snow they call kitty litter. It's kind of like these tiny little pearls that under the certain circumstances can fall out of the sky. Anyway, so that, so that introduced me to an area that was pretty good, lived basically off a huge pharmaceutical organization. And it sounded to me like a good place to get started, Besides, I had to do something with the money.
So looking back, Philadelphia, I assume, is more of a cash flow as opposed to an appreciation market. Is that accurate?
If I had known more, then yes, but I wasn't really in downtown Philadelphia. It was more in the center of Lansdale, which is like within the public transportation sphere of Philadelphia, but it's more like a suburb.
Okay.
So we ultimately didn't really end up keeping the property because I learned after I did it and never regretted it, but I learned that you really want to have cash flow, like you just said. So then from then on, basically started investing in properties that didn't just have a chance to appreciate and have tenants, but also have cash flow.
Let's talk a little bit about, I know you talk about time freedom and passive income, right? So obviously that was a great starting point. Kind of where are you today? Because it sounds like obviously you've transitioned the mentality in terms of how you're investing. And I'm guessing those are two pretty big tenants. So, how do you articulate what they mean to you?
Yeah, so fundamentally talking about the time freedom point and the time freedom number and time freedom in general is a really core aspect of what I'm helping people with through mentoring and through the advice that I give those who come to us and say, hey, I want to do the same thing. Just before we go into any details, what I've learned, and I think this might be informative to your audience, the consulting business was something that I started because I wanted to take advantage of all the things I had learned in 22 years in the military and with military technology and stuff. But what I came to realize in the following, like about 10 years or so, maybe 15, is that a very, very repetitive type of activity where you, at least that's my personality, I always wanted to make impact, and I wasn't never really fully sure, does it really make that much a difference, whether it's me or whatever we put in place. And so when I started talking about this real estate investing, not just for me and within the family, but as a business in itself, I realized this is really more a passion project for me. So to answer that part of your question, where am I now? I'm basically past my time freedom point. Now, some people would say, well, if you pass your time freedom point number or point on the calendar, didn't that mean that you don't need to exchange time for money anymore? And I want to make clear also for your audience, what it really means is that you have the freedom to make choices, right? And so I have the freedom, and what I have basically decided is to more and more and more retire the consulting business and just do this real estate mentoring stuff because I, for one, love it. I have really grown into the topic. But the more important thing is that it really shows very literally the impact that it can have on people's life long term, right? And I have the total freedom to decide how much of it I want to do, because I want to get paid because it has value, but I'm not getting paid because I need the money to pay my living expenses. And there's a massive, massive difference. You have a completely different frame of mind. And one of the things for your audience that I love to give them is what I call a mindset manual that I wrote, because I'm coming across a lot of people who, when I initially talk to them, whether they come to me because they want to get on that ideal investor journey and reach their time freedom point or something else, is that there's a lot of victimhood. And a lot of like, I'm determined by external influences. I'm not really in charge of my journey. I'm not really in charge of my life. I'm basically like a puppet that is being operated by some external entities. And the mindset manual is one way, together with the little video series that comes with it on YouTube, to get more into a creator mindset where you are creating your paths, you making your choices, you're getting to your time freedom point, and then beyond that, make the choice: do you want, like me, continue the stuff that you're really passionate about, or you become a painter, or you're a musician, or you just find a beach and sit there in the sun, or whatever your freedom choice actually is.
It's fascinating once you start unpacking some of that, right? Because once you come to the realization that everything you do in the day is your choice and you're choosing to do something, it unlocks so much, right? And it seems so fundamental, but I think so many people are locked into this reactive or, I must go to work, I must do what my boss tells me, I must work longer, right? And it's like, no, you've got the choice. And once you come to that.
Yeah, there's also, you're absolutely right, Liam. There's also one component that I didn't anticipate, because I didn't really have much of an idea how would life beyond that time freedom point actually look like in reality. And for a moment, forget about the financial component. And what I find is that it's not just the freedom to make those choices, it's also putting me or anybody who is in that position into a different state of power, right? Because when you look at how most people interact with each other, where one has to give something and the other one needs something, if you're dependent on the financial outcome of that transaction, the power is not always so clearly identified. And where I am now, and some of our clients have gotten, and I know I'm assuming some of your guests and some of your clients have come, I have the power to say, if what you present to me, I don't like, I don't do it. If you are a client who tells me I have all these quirks and I want you to accommodate all my quirks, I have the power and the freedom to say, that's fine, but there's probably someone out there who wants to deal with that. I don't, right? So these kind of things where you can really say it's not just the freedom to make decisions, you also have the power to say no. And I think that's very, very kind of pun intended powerful to have that freedom.
It's amazing how much more I say no now than I did before. And it's liberating, right? It's like I don't feel forced to do anything. There's more clarity in what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it. And when something doesn't align, it's very easy just to say no, because it doesn't help me on my mission or my vision or where I'm headed. And pre getting to whether it's the time freedom point or that acknowledgement of power and choice, right? I think there was saying yes a lot out of perceived obligation, right? Or being on the other side of that give take exchange and feeling like I had to. And in reality, you don't. And once you get to that point, the mind is so much more creative, right? You're more fulfilled, you're more balanced, harmonious, right? Doesn't mean you work less, because you could choose to work really hard on certain.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And I mean, one thing that I noticed, which is almost counterintuitive, I believe, is that when people know that you have that choice to say yes or no, and you decided to say yes, somehow that releases gratitude. Right. I have so many examples where people keep thanking me, even to the extent where I say, okay, you don't have to repeat it every time we have a call, or every time, like, I know that you're grateful. I'm trying my best to help you, and we are in this together to achieve a common goal. But it's a totally different environment than previously in the consulting work, where we're paying you a shitload of money, so to speak, so we are entitled to get the very best. And if we need you at 6 a.m. in the morning or 8 p.m. at night, you better be here, right? And so it's a very, very different engagement, a different relationship, a different kind of communication. And like I said, I mean, I really find the word gratitude in this context that is immediately connected to impact important, and it makes the whole thing so much more fun.
Yeah, for sure. And when you were talking about who you partner with, right? Like, I've got a simple rule where I don't work with assholes, right? And further along, right? If they don't align with my values, I don't work with them again, because I don't have to, right? And it's like, why would I put myself through that pain? But I think it's so fundamentally important, and the unlocks as I compare my life in that space versus where it was previously, it's night and day, and just so much more fulfilled and energetic and lively, and encourage people to explore that to get to that point, right? And,
yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, I mean, one of the things that is probably in these times that we are entering right now, I'm a big believer in books like The Fourth Turning, or the latest book from Ray Dalio about what is called the choice of worlds, or changes in the worlds, or something like that. Both basically saying, okay, the world operates in huge cycles, and then sub-cycles and sub-cycles within it, but things aren't there forever. And when you ask yourself, and we see some of it, the Fed says, okay, we're going to increase interest rates, and nobody knows how often and when and exactly how. Right now, they're still pumping money into a crazy economy that couldn't run any hotter than it is, right? And you ask yourself, okay, so you guys really have this full in hand, right? You know what you're doing. We have 7.5% CPI, and you're still putting money in. How, anyways. So what I'm finding is what we're doing when I'm working with our clients, by helping them to actually invest in real assets, literally real estate, long-term value assets, that also is gratifying in the sense that it not just gives them something for the moment, but it, besides building a legacy, it also builds a portfolio that has longevity, right? And that for me is important, because I have had the pleasure of working with a number of clients who somewhere on the journey realize, oh, this is going to provide for me and my family. But even if my relatively small kids have kids. If they do it right, they will have the benefit of that too, or at least part of it, right? And that's a component. There are so many different things that people could do. And I feel very grateful that we're doing something by investing in all these different kinds of real estate, residential real estate in that sense, that it builds basically a portfolio that will potentially last forever because people will always need a place to live.
So let's unpack that a bit. I see you've got a turnkey book behind you, right? We've talked about cash flow. We've talked about cash flow markets versus appreciation markets. So, and we talked about real estate being that tangible thing for you. Kind of what's the main strategy that you support in terms of how do you generate that income to get to that time freedom point? Or are there several within the real estate space that you would recommend?
No, actually, it's quite interesting, even though it's almost like one of those, I don't know if you're familiar with the term fractal, right? So if you ever look at the initial picture that you see of a fractal and then you zoom in and it's the same shape, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's kind of what my experience is with the strategy that we're following, called the outer state residential real estate turnkey investing strategy.
Okay.
And it's out of state because, at least when I first started, I was in California, still am in California, and there's just no well-performing real estate, right? People always look at price. I couldn't care less about price. For me, everything, and I try to preach people and teach people, it's all about performance. If I can find $1 million property and somebody is paying me $100,000 a month in rent, it's well-performing. Just hard to find, right? So why is it out of state? Because you can rather find $100,000 property where somebody pays you $1,000 rent, right? But the ratio is the same. That's what we're looking for performance. So that's out of state residential because the government makes rules that clearly favor people who invest in residential because we're basically thrown as investors in the same bucket as if you and I just look for a house for ourselves. Same rates, same rules, same tax benefits, all of that. So that's why residential. And then turnkey is because if you're a business owner and you say, okay, I want to invest in real estate, but I have no time to find the place and renovate the place and flip the place and manage the place and take the phone calls of the tenants and all that kind of stuff. So that's what you take a turnkey company for. So what they do is, I always say, they find the ugly duckling in the neighborhood, in a good neighborhood. They renovate it. They put a price tag on it that appraises, so they can sell it to you for that number or slightly below. And then they manage it for you after you bought it from them. So all you do is basically agree to buy it, then basically have them manage it and you collect the rent payment and pay your mortgage. And you can even automate that nowadays so that your mortgage payment is automatically deducted from the bank account. So that makes it very passive because all that's left at the end of the month is your positive cash flow. And that's very repeatable, which is also why business owners or anybody who has a highly time consuming activity likes to work in our model, because you can have 10 of those and it's pretty much still the same, right? If you have 10 or 15 or 2 or 3, it doesn't matter. So then when I say, okay, it's like a fractal, we started out with this approach, purely older properties renovated, sold, managed. Then we found out, okay, well, this now also, because of the Fed policy, also works with built property, brand new built properties. And there are some intricacies that would take too far to go into why that can be even more interesting. Then the third fractal that we basically dug into is, okay, could we use a turnkey property and have it professionally managed, but as a vacation rental? And that works too. And then the last fractal that we now got into is to say, does it have to be in the United States or could it be in desirable locations like beach in Belize or in Puerto Rico or somewhere else in the world that is a desirable vacation place where I can own a property from a turnkey provider that is managed by the turnkey provider, includes the short-term rental. So they go out on the Airbnbs and travel agency websites like Expedia, get the clients, the tenants in there. And the same end result is one more deposit in the bank account, and one more automatic deduction for the financing. And you have, again, cash flow left over. And if you do this often enough, you get to a number, and the number is individual. Everybody has their own number. People that listen to us can probably imagine my number here in San Diego is a little higher than somebody's number in Philadelphia, for example. Not because they live better or worse, but because some of the costs of living are just different in different locations. And so then it's really a matter of how much does each property generate in positive cash flow at the end of the month, and how many multiples of those do I need before I get to my number. And that then ultimately determines, okay, if you say I can buy one of these every year and my number is, let's say, $6,000 and each does 500 a month on average, then I know I need 12. So it's 12 years from now to when you don't have to really dance like a puppet anymore.
You talked about well-performing asset, which coming from the German background and high efficiency and performance makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the price and you talked about the rents, and it looked like there was a 1% ratio there. Is there a rule that you kind of look at for what you determine performance at?
Well, I used to really literally take that 1% rule as a guideline or a guide post. The thing about it is, yes, even nowadays you can find properties that are even better performing than 1%. But what ultimately happens, and this is something that I've learned since I started around 2005, is that a lot of things, and more than we initially think, are all have to be in balance with each other. Right. And so if you say, I want more performance, you probably won't get that when you say, but I also want a nice neighborhood. Right. So I always say you can get 2%, but you have to have a Kevlar vest and an AK-47, and then you get, 2%. So, most people don't want that. Or you can go into developments where the goal is to just get in and out real quick. Right, that wouldn't work necessarily in residential, but as I'm trying to be a good shepherd and good guide for the people that come to me, I naturally have to know a little bit of how does apartment work, how does commercial real estate work. And so in apartments, if you find a rundown apartment complex that is owned by somebody who just fell into hard times or whatever and never really paid good attention to it, but it's in a really good neighborhood and you can convince them to sell it to you, and you improve it up to a good standard, because the calculation of an apartment complex is completely different. It's not like what we know as owners or buyers of residential real estate, where your value is compared to the value in the neighborhood. In an apartment complex, it's all based on how much rent does it make. Well, if it's, excuse my French, a shitty place, it makes low rent. If you make it all pretty and updated and granite countertops and new kitchens and bathrooms and all of that, it gets market rate. And the value goes, if you improve something by 30 or 40% in a year through the renovation, every time one of your tenants moves out, you renovate the next one until you're all the way through, well, you can easily double the value of that place. But to really make it work well is then you would say, now I put it on the market, and your whole engagement was maybe 5 years long. That's also one of the reasons why syndications or apartment deals or stuff like that are not necessarily what I'm basically preaching, because I'm always looking for this time freedom point at which you can remain to be totally passive as far as the investment goes and do all the other things that you would like to do. Right? You don't want to, and I never really wanted to have this as a second job. Right now, it's not a problem when that's your hobby or your passion and you want to do it like I'm doing it now, but it wasn't and isn't supposed to be something that takes on a lot of work. And so, long story short on that is the performance aspect is a matter of how do you balance good school, good neighborhood, good local transportation, good, migration patterns, for example. Why is it so crazy right now in Florida and Texas? Because so many people move there. And we have a shortage in real estate, in residential real estate to begin with. And then you have certain states where there's so many people coming, even in the best of times, there was no way to ever build enough new housing to accommodate them all. So supply and demand is a thing that most people understand. If there is little supply and lots of demand, even a totally brand new built house can make sense. Right? So those things, you have to balance those things, and then you end up with some rules. Now, as prices have increased and wages haven't kept up pace, and anybody who's in business probably currently not too happy about it because all their employees come to them and say, boss, I need more money. But that's still in the early stages while the prices for real estate have gone up already. And so right now, if you can get like 0.85 as that well-performing ratio, you're in a good place. You might not make quite as much cash flow right off the bat as you would want to if you get 1%. But I'm optimistic that in a year or two, the wage growth will bring it back to where it was maybe 3-4 years ago.
As you've talked to people, right, and obviously for the audience, and we're getting ready to wrap up here, but what's the one thing that, piece of advice that you would give to people who are at the starting point of this journey, and what they should do or what they should look at, to prepare themselves for the future, get to that time freedom point?
Well, the first thing, it's not just one thing, it's a little bit of a group of things. The first thing is to say, look at what you currently have your money invested in and try to identify how volatile is that place. Like, for example, you could argue right now, if somebody for the last 10 years has regularly invested in the stock market, they did pretty well. But if you look at the last 12 months, you see an extremely increasing amount of volatility. And if you just read the news about financial stuff, forget all the other stuff, just financials, you will obviously find out this is like something that is just about getting ready to fall off a cliff, right? So now then the second aspect why I say it's not just one thing, if you recognize this is somewhat close to your situation, a substantial amount of money in 401ks and stock market investments, stuff like that. And you take into consideration how much time do I either give myself or have if I had a massive loss happening, something like a 50% correction. And just on a side note, a 50% correction or 40% correction means the money from that point on to get back to where it was almost has to double. People forget that, right? It doesn't mean 50% down also goes then 50% up. No, it goes 50% down and 100% up. That's why I say, if you say, okay, that let's say happens in next year, just for sake of argument, and you find out you're in your 40s, do you really want to wait another 10 years to get back to where you are now? If that's kind of sounding like it's your situation, then you want to take all the good stuff that you did in the last 10 years in the stock market or any kind of investments like that, crypto is a similar one, and bring it into something that is more value oriented and long-term oriented, and come to me and I help you or other people in our industry to help you. But it's not a sales pitch. It's just to say, and this is why I mentioned this earlier, Liam, if you either like Ray Dalio or you like this older book called The Fourth Turning and you read it, then you will recognize everything goes in cycles. And the cycle that brought new technology, computers, high growth in stock markets and stuff like that is coming to an end. And us being the superpower that basically drives everything seems to be on more and more shaky ground, whether we want it or not. I mean, we can't deny that China is out there and the Asian area is out there, and they have about 4 times, 5 times as many people as us, right? So that all exists. And the question becomes, okay, what do I or can I do to be as passive as possible and secure the fruit of my previous labor? That's the main reason, why I'm saying, okay, if I'm in some value assets that go to, and I really go to Maslow, right? I say, okay, Maslow's pyramid says, what are the 3 basic things? Security, food, and shelter. Well, I did security for 22 years in the Air Force, not a farmer. I can provide shelter, right? And so one of the things I think you want to do, if you can do your own homestead somewhere in Alaska or whatever, or you can do like one of those 20-year food supplies, like what are they calling these guys? Or you can provide shelter to other people and they will reward you handsomely.
Yeah. So you'd mentioned if people are interested that they can connect with you. What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, if you go to our website, ideawealthgrower.com, my web people made it so that almost instantaneously you get to the homepage. It says set up a strategy session, totally free. We chat, we analyze your situation. And I'm always the first person to say, not what we do is not for everybody, right? We look at it, and if it's good for you and you like what we do, then we work together. And if not, then I can at least point you in the right direction.
Excellent. Appreciate your time, Axel.
Yeah, Liam, thank you. It was great fun and great questions.
Thank you.